this yet?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. Thank you. So just a little bit of a short introduction and background to myself and how I'm approaching this particular and hugely important topic for India's future. I'm the director of research at WRI, and before that, I've been a researcher and a teacher in higher education, graduate education, and generally in the fields of public policy and planning. So, a lot of that work really is focusing on bringing different bodies of knowledge together and also applying knowledge to action and to making changes for our betterment and our the environment's betterment as well. So I've taught abroad. I've taught in the US and the UK. And after I returned in India, I've been involved in thinking through and setting up some of there's a great interest right now in public policy education. So setting up schools of public policy, such as the Indian School of Public Policy in Delhi. And in all of these schools, the environment and environmental education is a very, very central arena for public policy. And it's also interconnected with other areas, including development and education. And in WRI, where I've been for a little more than a year, my role is also, in some ways, it continues my role as an educator, because within WRI, I'm also trying to strengthen our own capacity to address and offer policy that's rigorously grounded in research and in evidence, and then also translating what we know from scientific research and scientific research to actual action and change on the ground. I'm approaching this from that background, so there's going to be a little less of a focus on climate change per se, but more on the larger context of our education system, and how, in a way, that has to change in parallel for us to be able to really use education to make the kind of changes we want and to equip our future generations to both, address climate change, to solve climate problems and issues, and also to be resilient in the face of the crises that they will be facing now. So let me first begin with, climate change itself has a profound effect on education. And we know through years of research and experience that education is a critical aspect of human development. And one thing I want to highlight is that climate change itself has already had a profound effect, a negative effect on educational outcomes across the world, and particularly in poorer countries. So increased climate vulnerabilities and exposure to climate-related events have been related to a decrease in educational attainment across countries and regions. And there are direct and indirect effects of this. So the direct ones are the destruction of infrastructure and climate-related events, loss of income and livelihoods, additional barriers that are created from extreme heat, from drought, that prevent people from accessing education or sending their children to school. And if they're in school, from performing adequately or getting the education they need. And then we also know that we found that when they drop out of school, and this is especially going to be a very critical issue now with the coronavirus crisis, that once the crisis stops, so first of all, how many particularly poorer children have not really been able to continue their education adequately because they don't have the resources, they don't have computers, they don't have broadband. And then and it's very difficult when you've got poorer people, and especially girls and children, into school, the chances of their completing education reduce. So this is something we have to really be thinking of once we start, opening up and getting back to whatever the new normal is post-coronavirus. That we're not creating that, but that we're tackling this potential harm to the larger education system. And as in many things, in climate change itself, as in the coronavirus itself, this kind of reduction in educational attainment or the barriers that are created to gaining an education, these impacts are the most acute on the poorest and disadvantaged groups across the world, and very much so in India. Now, from the opposite lens, another relationship between climate change, education, and this is kind of building up on some of what Dr. Sarabhai was saying, that climate change education in itself has been found or is likely to have some sort of a relationship or may impact future behavior. And what I'm presenting here the results of a new study peer-reviewed study that was just published, where they are looking at that this is a survey 5 or 6 years later of the participants in a particular sort of climate and environmental knowledge and action sort of course in US universities. And they followed up with them and conducted surveys several years later. And they are suggesting that that the knowledge they gained had a sort of like much longer term effect on not just on their knowledge but on their behaviors. And they argue that modeling their from the changes in behavior, how that would affect their individual carbon emissions. They're sort of arguing that climate change education, effective models of climate change education itself, can play a huge role in reducing carbon emissions by individuals. And the more they are aware of how it affects both them personally as well as future generations, the more they understand, the more of an effect it is likely to have on their behaviors and ultimately on their projected emissions. Now, what should climate change education be like in India? And we've talked a lot about this, so I'm in a way sort of summarizing a lot of what I've heard today. And I think the most central thing we see here that the focus, this is in the US, and very much of the focus is primarily on carbon reduction. And we know that climate change is so much more. We used to call it global warming. And for us in India, as that picture shows, that's really a very central element. And that has profoundly different both impacts and models of action and resilience in different parts of the world. So climate change education within India must be contextualized and place-based, right? We cannot focus just on say, we all care about polar ice caps and polar bears and things, but that does tend to seem far more abstract, far more far away, particularly for people who don't necessarily who are dealing with immediate effects in their daily life. So climate change education really must be contextualized and place-based, and that becomes highly localized in some ways within states such as vast as Gujarat. It's very different in cities and rural areas and coastal areas versus inland areas, and there's a really wide variation in how climate change is playing out, and because of that, also in what actions must be taken to address this and to build resilience. And the goal of climate change education really should be to develop values, knowledge, and the skills to apply knowledge to solve problems and create new knowledge. And this is a very important thing, and this isn't typically how we thought of our education system. It has been traditionally, we've inherited a very colonial model where the idea is that we are imparting bits of knowledge which will be internalized rather than equipping people to especially young people and children, but also young people in colleges and universities. For us to solve the problems, we will need to create new knowledge and create new solutions. And that ability to think creatively and to apply that knowledge is really the most critical missing element in some ways in the formal education system in India. What I often see is that these aspects, these ways of approaching problems definitely exist, but they're not integrated enough into the formal education system, which it's changing, but it continues to be very much exam-oriented rather than applied, rather than emphasizing the ability that communities, that children, that students have often to create new knowledge itself. And this, again, and this very much plays into this idea of it being contextualized and place-based. If we start looking at what we know about climate change, and about how to resolve it and resilience, we know a whole lot more about its global dimensions. We know a whole lot more about how it plays out even within India and certain parts of India, and there are other areas where there are huge gaps. And that local knowledge and application and problem solving will really have to be created by students and communities and people themselves. And then climate education must go beyond the formal education system. I know that Gujarat has done some really interesting work in this area with the community science centers. Across the world, there's been an explosion on things like citizen science, where citizens themselves are observing and trying to understand dimensions of climate change and its impacts that we don't still fully know in terms of what formal scientific world knows. So I think these areas will be very central to climate education or to education for climate action. And then finally, climate change education, Dr. Majumdar already focused on this, and she had a very nice slide about it. It needs to be integrated. So it needs to connect across subjects, disciplines, levels, and domains of action. So what is integrative education? So this is the idea, and I think across the world, more and more we have been, just as government departments have often been siloed in crises like climate change and coronavirus are kind of, forcing us in some ways to create new systems of coordination, to think of interconnections rather than vertical silos in which these are government systems have been traditionally organized. Our scientific disciplines, our ways of understanding the world within the education system have also been very, very siloed. I remember for once in India, it's been particularly bad in that in class 10, you sort of have to choose between the sciences and the art stream or commerce. And that's really kind of in some ways the opposite of creating, of thinking how these different streams and ways of seeing and understanding the world are really fundamentally interconnected, and especially so when we are facing new, very broadly encompassing crises like climate change. So integrated education is really focused on connecting skills and knowledge from multiple sources and experiences, including their own lived experience, right? So a lot of what they will learn from books about climate change will help them to interpret and understand what they're actually living through and experiencing in the real world. But that may not actually be reflected in the books that they're reading or the scientific literature. Understanding issues and positions contextually. So this, as I emphasize again, context becomes hugely important when it comes to the environment, and applying skills and practices in various settings, and people being able to understand diverse and even contradictory points of view. And one of this is kind of resolving a particular model of scientific knowledge with other ways of knowing and understanding and responding to the world, which is kind of, as Dr. Sarabhai talked about, some of the traditional and local knowledges and skills. And these should not be seen as fundamentally opposed, but different ways in which societies can actually address and respond to changing world. And this idea of integrated learning is meant to enable students to bring together concept, methods, and languages from two or more disciplines or establish area of expertise in order to explain a phenomenon, solve a problem, create a product, or raise a new question. These are the goals of education that are really not captured very well at all in the traditional exam-based model. So in some ways, I think an effective education system that can actually tackle climate change and build resilience will kind of call for a larger change in the education system itself. One example, so there are various models of integrative education. So, there's been a very powerful movement within the STEM, science, technology, and engineering fields to integrate arts and humanities within this learning. And now, even in the teaching of mathematics, there's a consideration of where mathematics and art can intersect. So this idea, so integrative, and there's a whole system of curricula, approaches to learning on integrative education in the STEM fields. There are also, I did a bit of research with specific reference to education systems and curricula on climate change and integrative climate change learning. So Cambodia has apparently now just launched a very comprehensive model that does look very integratively and connects, again, what students are learning in their books very much to their actual life and their lived experience and their actions. So these are some models that we could look at, and there may be models within India as well that would be useful. And the other thing is that when we are trying models in India, we also need to keep evaluating and assessing them and thinking of the larger outcomes, what sort of changes they're making, what enables them, what are the challenges that people who are implementing these changes face. So as I said, this is integrative learning is about making connections between knowledge and practice. And this is something I do not know the answer to this, and especially as a researcher, I would not claim to have any solutions. But I think this is the key question here: that what if the state of Gujarat or of India as a whole is trying to create an integrative climate education system that can address the challenges and build resilience and equip future generations to find solutions to climate change, what would such an education system involve? Now, some of the existing research suggests these aspects are essential. So connecting knowledge and learning to students' lives, creating a culture of stewardship and action, and enabling students to create change in their communities and places. So that, makes, often when it's just an exam-based system or it's very disconnected from the meaning and purpose in their lives, students can get either very disengaged or, the central purpose here is really for them to be able to create change and places. And in some ways, if you think of the existing, I think of the education system that I went through in India, and I know it's changing, but this would require quite a major transformation for us to be here, to be in a place where where education really becomes about these things, say, rather than individual attainment. Amartya Sen has written a book, I think, called the First Boy or something, where we've tended to have an exam culture that's very, very competitive, that values much more things like marks and subject skills that kind of silos us into particular areas. So we will really, I think, need a transformation. And I think this is where I know that this is the climate department and not the education department, but that breaking of silos has to happen, of course, within how we govern education, and curricula. So this is my last slide. So when we think of climate education, we need to think about it in a way it can play a central role in transforming the Indian education system to better equip future generations to find solutions and build resilience. Both individual resilience in their communities, and resilience for the nation at home. And the education system is that there's a lot of pressures to change. Climate change is one of them, but there's been rapid technological and social change, which really, has made knowledge in some ways accessible to young people from many sources outside of their schools. And not all of this knowledge is valid. There's fake news, but there's also huge ways in which WRI has these data platforms, for instance, and resource platforms. There are ways in which the world is in some ways available to them in ways that it wasn't when we were younger. We have failed or inadequate models of education. As I said before, we've inherited a kind of colonial education system. And then in some ways we've absorbed a very American model of education, which has also been very individualized. It's about personal attainment. It's about, it's very built into a particular model of growth and development. And these education models are very inadequate to the challenges that we face right now. We're also in an environment in India where there are some significant policy changes in the education space and a lot of experimentation and innovation with new systems of education, with new curricula, with new frameworks, with new mechanisms of delivery. And coronavirus itself is kind of leading to some of this experimentation and innovation. And finally, what the future generations, where they will be facing a world of increasing uncertainty and recurring crises. So this resilience is important, and it plays not into not just what they know, but how they are able to cope with it. And we see that there's a mental health crisis, there's amounts of stress, and these are particularly so amongst groups that are most vulnerable, that are in some way have the least resources to deal with this kind of uncertainty, crises, constant risk, and vulnerability. And the education system, the goal has been ideally that an education reduces inequalities, and that has really not happened. So that's again another way in which our existing models have really failed and been inadequate, in that they have really failed to eradicate the inequalities that we have. And climate education must really take that into account and not continue that path where we continue. Climate crisis, as we know, increases and it affects different groups differently. And any education system must really center that aspect and not entrench, but really see. So this is what I end with. So I think that developing and implementing integrative frameworks for climate education will contribute to how India rethinks the purpose, goals, and means of educating future generations. So it's not just that education will contribute to addressing the climate crisis, but in just as significant a way, the sort of ways in which we need to transform education to address the climate crisis will really change the entire education system. And the education system, as I said before, is essential to human. So in some ways, this is a very important link between climate and development that I think we need to explore further. So that's I'll end with this slide. Thank you.